Recorded Books presents an unabridged recording of A Separate Reality, Further Conversations with Don Juan by Carlos Castaneda, narrated by Luis Moreno.
Introduction. 10 years ago, I had the fortune of meeting a Yaqui Indian from northwestern Mexico. I call him Don Juan. In Spanish, Don is an appellative used to denote respect. I made Don Juan's acquaintance under the most fortuitous circumstances. I was sitting with Bill, a friend of mine, in a bus depot in a border town in Arizona. We were very quiet. In the late afternoon, the summer heat seemed unbearable. Suddenly, he leaned over and tapped me on the shoulder. "There's the man I told you about," he said in a low voice. He nodded casually toward the entrance. An old man had just walked in. "What did you tell me about him?" I asked. "He's the Indian that knows about peyote, remember?" I remembered that Bill and I had once driven all day looking for the house of an eccentric Mexican Indian who lived in the area. We didn't find the man's house, and I had the feeling that the Indians whom we'd asked for directions had deliberately misled us. Bill had told me that the man was a yerbero, a person who gathers and sells medicinal herbs, and that he knew a great deal about the hallucinogenic cactus, peyote. He had also said that it would be worth my while to meet him. Bill was my guide in the Southwest while I was collecting information and specimens of medicinal plants used by the Indians of the area. Bill got up and went to greet the man. The Indian was of medium height. His hair was white and short, and grew a bit over his ears, accentuating the roundness of his head. He was very dark. The deep wrinkles on his face gave him the appearance of age, yet his body seemed to be strong and fit. I watched him for a moment. He moved around with a nimbleness that I would have thought impossible for an old man. Bill signaled me to join them. "He's a nice guy," Bill said to me, "but I can't understand him. His Spanish is weird, full of rural colloquialisms, I suppose." The old man looked at Bill and smiled, and Bill, who speaks only a few words of Spanish, made up an absurd phrase in that language. He looked at me as if asking whether he was making sense, but I didn't know what he had had in mind. He then smiled shyly and walked away. The old man looked at me and began laughing. I explained to him that my friend sometimes forgot that he didn't speak Spanish. "I think he also forgot to introduce us," I said, and I told him my name. "And I am Juan Matus, at your service," he said. We shook hands and remained quiet for some time. I broke the silence and told him about my enterprise. I told him that I was looking for any kind of information on plants, especially peyote. I talked compulsively for a long time, and although I was almost totally ignorant on the subject, I said I knew a great deal about peyote. I thought that if I boasted about my knowledge, he would become interested in talking to me. But he didn't say anything. He listened patiently. Then he nodded slowly and peered at me. His eyes seemed to shine with a light of their own. I avoided his gaze. I felt embarrassed. I had the certainty that at that moment he knew I was talking nonsense. "Come to my house sometime," he finally said, taking his eyes away from me. "Perhaps we could talk there with more ease." I didn't know what else to say. I felt uneasy. After a while, Bill came back into the room. He recognized my discomfort and didn't say a word. We sat in tight silence for some time. Then the old man got up. His bus had come. He said goodbye. "It didn't go too well, did it?" Bill asked. "No." "Did you ask him about plants?" "I did, but I think I goofed." "I told you, he's very eccentric. The Indians around here know him, yet they never mention him, and that's something." "He said I could come to his house, though." He was bullshitting you. Sure, you can go to his house, but what does it mean? He'll never tell you anything. If you ever ask him anything, he'll clam up as if you were an idiot talking nonsense. Bill said convincingly that he had encountered people like him before, people who gave the impression of knowing a great deal. In his judgment, he said, such people weren't worth the trouble because sooner or later one could obtain the same information from someone else who didn't play hard to get. He said that he had neither patience nor time for old fogies, and that it was possible that the old man was only presenting himself as being knowledgeable about herbs, when in reality he knew as little as the next man. Bill went on talking, but I wasn't listening. My mind kept on wondering about the old Indian. He knew I'd been bluffing. I remembered his eyes. They had actually shone. I went back to see him a couple of months later, not so much as a student of anthropology interested in medicinal plants, but as a person with an inexplicable curiosity. The way he had looked at me was an unprecedented event in my life. I wanted to know what was involved in that look. It became almost an obsession with me. I pondered it, and the more I thought about it, the more unusual it seemed to be. Don Juan and I became friends, and for a year I paid him innumerable visits. I found his manner very reassuring and his sense of humor superb, but above all, I felt there was a silent consistency about his acts, a consistency which was thoroughly baffling to me. I felt a strange delight in his presence, and at the same time I experienced a strange discomfort. His mere company forced me to make a tremendous reevaluation of my models of behavior. I had been reared, perhaps like everyone else, to have a readiness to accept man as an essentially weak and fallible creature. What impressed me about Don Juan was the fact that he didn't make a point of being weak and helpless, and just being around him ensured an unfavorable comparison between his way of behaving and mine. Perhaps one of the most impressive statements he made to me at that time was concerned with our inherent difference. Prior to one of my visits, I had been feeling quite unhappy about the total course of my life and about a number of pressing personal conflicts that I had. When I arrived at his house, I felt moody and nervous. We were talking about my interest in knowledge, but as usual, we were on two different tracks. I was referring to academic knowledge that transcends experience, while he was talking about direct knowledge of the world. "Do you know anything about the world around you?" he asked. "I know all kinds of things," I said. "I mean, do you ever feel the world around you?" "I feel as much of the world around me as I can." "That's not enough. You must feel everything. Otherwise, the world loses its sense." I voiced the classical argument that I didn't have to taste the soup in order to know the recipe, nor did I have to get an electric shock in order to know about electricity. "You make it sound stupid," he said. "The way I see it, you want to cling to your arguments despite the fact that they bring nothing to you. You want to remain the same, even at the cost of your well-being." "I don't know what you're talking about." "I am talking about the fact that you're not complete. You have no peace." That statement annoyed me. I felt offended. I thought he was certainly not qualified to pass judgment on my acts or my personality. "You're plagued with problems," he said. "Why?" "I'm only a man, Don Juan," I said peevishly. I made that statement in the same vein my father used to make it. Whenever he said he was only a man, he implicitly meant he was weak and helpless, and his statement, like mine, was filled with an ultimate sense of despair. Don Juan peered at me, as he had done the first day we met. "You think about yourself too much," he said, and smiled. and that gives you a strange fatigue that makes you shut off the world around you and cling to your arguments. Therefore, all you have is problems. I'm only a man too, but I don't mean that the way you do. How do you mean it? I've vanquished my problems. Too bad my life is so short that I can't grab onto all the things I would like to. But that's not an issue. It's only a pity. I liked the tone of his statement. There was no despair or self-pity in it. In 1961, a year after our first meeting, Don Juan disclosed to me that he had a secret knowledge of medicinal plants. He told me he was a brujo. The Spanish word brujo can be rendered in English as sorcerer, medicine man, curer. From that point on, the relation between us changed. I became his apprentice, and for the next 4 years he endeavored to teach me the mysteries of sorcery. I have written about that apprenticeship in The Teachings of Don Juan, a Yaqui way of knowledge. Our conversations were conducted in Spanish, and thanks to Don Juan's superb command of that language, I obtained detailed explanations of the intricate meanings of his system of beliefs. I've referred to that complex and well-systematized body of knowledge as sorcery, and I've referred to him as a sorcerer, because those were categories he himself used in informal conversations. In the context of more serious elucidations, however, he would use the terms knowledge to categorize sorcery, and man of knowledge, or one who knows, to categorize a sorcerer. In order to teach and corroborate his knowledge, Don Juan used 3 well-known psychotropic plants: peyote, or Lophophora williamsii, Jimson weed, Datura inoxia, and a species of mushroom which belongs to the genus Psilocybe. Through the separate ingestion of each of these hallucinogens, he produced in me, as his apprentice, some peculiar states of distorted perception or altered consciousness, which I have called states of non-ordinary reality. I have used the word reality because it was a major premise in Don Juan's system of beliefs that the states of consciousness produced by the ingestion of any of those 3 plants were not hallucinations, but concrete, although unordinary, aspects of the reality of everyday life. Don Juan behaved toward these states of non-ordinary reality not as if they were real, but as real. To classify these plants as hallucinogens and the states they produced as non-ordinary reality is, of course, my own device. Don Juan understood and explained the plants as being vehicles that would conduct or lead a man to certain impersonal forces, or powers, and the states they produced as being the meetings that a sorcerer had to have with those powers in order to gain control over them. He called peyote mezcalito, and he explained it as being a benevolent teacher and protector of men. Mezcalito taught the right way to live. Peyote was usually ingested at gatherings of sorcerers called mitotes, where the participants would gather specifically to seek a lesson on the right way to live. Don Juan considered the Jimson weed and the mushrooms to be powers of a different sort. He called them allies, and said that they were capable of being manipulated. A sorcerer, in fact, drew his strength from manipulating an ally. Of the 2, Don Juan preferred the mushroom. He maintained that the power contained in the mushroom was his personal ally, and he called it smoke, or little smoke. Don Juan's procedure to utilize the mushrooms was to let them dry into a fine powder inside a small gourd. He kept the gourd sealed for a year, and then mixed the fine powder with 5 other dry plants and produced a mixture for smoking in a pipe. In order to become a man of knowledge, one had to meet with the ally as many times as possible. One had to become familiar with it. This premise implied, of course, that one had to smoke the hallucinogenic mixture quite often. The process of smoking consisted of ingesting the fine mushroom powder, which didn't incinerate, and inhaling the smoke of the other 5 plants that made up the mixture. Don Juan explained the profound effects that the mushrooms had on one's perceptual capacities as the ally removing one's body. Don Juan's method of teaching required an extraordinary effort on the part of the apprentice. In fact, the degree of participation and involvement needed was so strenuous that by the end of 1965, I had to withdraw from the apprenticeship. I can say now, with the perspective of the 5 years that have elapsed, that at that time, Don Juan's teachings had begun to pose a serious threat to my idea of the world. I had begun to lose the certainty, which all of us have, that the reality of everyday life is something we can take for granted. At the time of my withdrawal, I was convinced that my decision was final. I didn't want to see Don Juan ever again. However, in April of 1968, an early copy of my book was made available to me, and I felt compelled to show it to him. I paid him a visit. Our link of teacher-apprentice was mysteriously reestablished, and I can say that on that occasion I began a second cycle of apprenticeship, very different from the first. My fear wasn't as acute as it had been in the past. The total mood of Don Juan's teachings was more relaxed. He laughed and also made me laugh a great deal. There seemed to be a deliberate intent on his part to minimize seriousness in general. He clowned during the truly crucial moments of this second cycle, and thus helped me to overcome experiences which could easily have become obsessive. His premise was that a light and amenable disposition was needed in order to withstand the impact and the strangeness of the knowledge he was teaching me. "The reason you got scared and quit is because you felt too damn important," he said, explaining my previous withdrawal. "Feeling important makes one heavy, clumsy, and vain. To be a man of knowledge, one needs to be light and fluid." Don Juan's particular interest in his second cycle of apprenticeship was to teach me to see. Apparently, in his system of knowledge, there was the possibility of making a semantic difference between seeing and looking as 2 distinct manners of perceiving. Looking referred to the ordinary way in which we're accustomed to perceive the world, while seeing entailed a very complex process by virtue of which a man of knowledge allegedly perceives the essence of the things of the world. In order to present the intricacies of this learning process in a readable form, I've condensed long passages of questions and answers, and thus I've edited my original field notes. It's my belief, however, that at this point, my presentation cannot possibly detract from the meaning of Don Juan's teachings. The editing was aimed at making my notes flow as conversation flows, so they would have the impact I desired. That is to say, I wanted, by means of a reportage, to communicate to the reader the drama and directness of the field situation. Each section I've set as a chapter was a session with Don Juan. As a rule, he always concluded each of our sessions on an abrupt note. Thus, the dramatic tone of the ending of each chapter is not a literary device of my own. It was a device proper of Don Juan's oral tradition. It seemed to be a mnemonic device that helped me to retain the dramatic quality and importance of the lessons. Certain explanations are needed, however, to make my reportage cogent, since its clarity depends on the elucidation of a number of key concepts or key units that I want to emphasize. This choice of emphasis is congruous with my interest in social science. It's perfectly possible that another person with a different set of goals and expectations would single out concepts entirely different from those I've chosen myself. During the second cycle of apprenticeship, Don Juan made a point of assuring me that the use of the smoking mixture was the indispensable prerequisite to seeing. Therefore, I had to use it as often as possible. "Only the smoke can give you the necessary speed to catch a glimpse of that fleeting world," he said. With the aid of the psychotropic mixture, he produced in me a series of states of non-ordinary reality. The main feature of such states, in relation to what Don Juan seemed to be doing, was a condition of inapplicability. What I perceived in those states of altered consciousness was incomprehensible and impossible to interpret by means of our everyday mode of understanding the world. In other words, the condition of inapplicability entailed the cessation of the pertinence of my worldview. Don Juan used this condition of inapplicability of the states of non-ordinary reality in order to introduce a series of preconceived new units of meaning. Units of meaning were all the single elements pertinent to the knowledge Don Juan was striving to teach me. I've called them units of meaning because they were the basic conglomerate of sensory data and their interpretations on which more complex meaning was constructed. One example of such a unit is the way in which the physiological effect of the psychotropic mixture was understood. It produced a numbness and a loss of motor control that was interpreted in Don Juan's system as an act performed by the smoke, which in this case was the ally, in order to remove the body of the practitioner. Units of meaning were grouped together in a specific way, and each block thus created formed what I've called a sensible interpretation. Obviously, there has to be an endless number of possible sensible interpretations that are pertinent to sorcery that a sorcerer must learn to make. In our day-to-day life, we're confronted with an endless number of sensible interpretations pertinent to it. A simple example could be the no longer deliberate interpretation, which we make scores of times every day, of the structure we call room. It's obvious that we have learned to interpret the structure we call room in terms of room. Thus, room is a sensible interpretation because it requires that at the time we make it, we are cognizant, in one way or another, of all the elements that enter into its composition. A system of sensible interpretation is, in other words, the process by virtue of which a practitioner is cognizant of all the units of meaning necessary to make assumptions, deductions, predictions, etc., about all the situations pertinent to his activity. By practitioner, I mean a participant who has an adequate knowledge of all or nearly all the units of meaning involved in his particular system of sensible interpretation. Don Juan was a practitioner, that is, he was a sorcerer who knew all the steps of his sorcery. As a practitioner, he attempted to make his system of sensible interpretation accessible to me. Such an accessibility, in this case, was equivalent to a process of re-socialization in which new ways of interpreting perceptual data were learned. I was the stranger, the one who lacked the capacity to make intelligent and congruous interpretations of the units of meaning proper to sorcery. Don Juan's task, as a practitioner making his system accessible to me, was to disarrange a particular certainty which I share with everyone else, the certainty that our common sense views of the world are final. Through the use of psychotropic plants and through well-directed contacts between the alien system and myself, he succeeded in pointing out to me that my view of the world cannot be final because it is only an interpretation. For the American Indian, perhaps for thousands of years, the vague phenomenon we call sorcery has been a serious, bona fide practice, comparable to that of our science. Our difficulty in understanding it stems, no doubt, from the alien units of meaning with which it deals. Don Juan had once told me that a man of knowledge had predilections. I asked him to explain his statement. "My predilection is to see," he said. "What do you mean by that?" "I like to see," he said, "because only by seeing can a man of knowledge know." "What kind of things do you see?" "Everything." But I also see everything, and I'm not a man of knowledge. No, you don't see. I think I do. I tell you, you don't. What makes you say that, Don Juan? You only look at the surface of things. Do you mean that every man of knowledge actually sees through everything he looks at? No, that's not what I mean. I said that a man of knowledge has his own predilections. Mine is just to see and to know. Others do other things. What other things, for example? Take Zacatecas. He's a man of knowledge, and his predilection is dancing. So he dances and knows. Is the predilection of a man of knowledge something he does in order to know? Yes, that's correct. But how could dancing help Zacatecas to know? One can say that Zacatecas dances with all he has. Does he dance like I dance? I mean, like dancing? Let's say that he dances like I see, and not like you may dance. Does he also see the way you see? Yes, but he also dances. How does Zacatecas dance? It's hard to explain that. It's a peculiar way of dancing he does when he wants to know. But all I can say about it is that unless you understand the ways of a man who knows, it's impossible to talk about dancing or seeing. Have you seen him doing his dancing? Yes. However, it's not possible for everyone who looks at his dancing to see that it is his peculiar way of knowing. I knew Zacatecas, or at least I knew who he was. We had met, and once I had bought him a beer. He was very polite and told me I should feel free to stop at his house any time I wanted to. I toyed for a long time with the idea of visiting him, but I didn't tell Don Juan. On the afternoon of May 14th, 1962, I drove up to Zacatecas' house. He had given me directions how to get there, and I had no trouble finding it. It was on a corner and had a fence all around it. The gate was closed. I walked around it to see if I could peek inside the house. It appeared to be deserted. Don Elias, I called out loud. The chickens got frightened and scattered about, cackling furiously. A small dog came to the fence. I expected it to bark at me. Instead, it just sat there, looking at me. I called out once again, and the chickens had another burst of cackling. An old woman came out of the house. I asked her to call Don Elias. He's not here, she said. Where can I find him? He's in the fields. Where in the fields? I don't know. Come back in the late afternoon. He'll be here around 5. Are you Don Elias's wife? Yes, I'm his wife, she said and smiled. I tried to ask her about Zacatecas, but she excused herself and said that she didn't speak Spanish well. I got into my car and drove away. I returned to the house around 6 o'clock. I drove to the door and yelled Zacatecas' name. This time, he came out of the house. I turned on my tape recorder, which in its brown leather case looked like a camera hanging from my shoulder. He seemed to recognize me. Oh, it's you, he said, smiling. How's Juan? He's fine, but how are you, Don Elias? He didn't answer. He seemed to be nervous. Overtly, he was very composed, but I felt that he was ill at ease. Has Juan sent you here on some sort of errand? No, I came here by myself. What in the world for? His question seemed to betray very bona fide surprise. I just wanted to talk to you, I said, hoping to sound as casual as possible. Don Juan has told me marvelous things about you, and I got curious and wanted to ask you a few questions. Zacatecas was standing in front of me. His body was lean and wiry. He was wearing khaki pants and shirt. His eyes were half closed. He seemed to be sleepy or perhaps drunk. His mouth was open a bit and his lower lip hung. I noticed that he was breathing deeply and seemed to be almost snoring. The thought came to me that Zacatecas was undoubtedly plastered out of his mind. But that thought seemed to be very incongruous because only a few minutes before, when he came out of his house, he had been very alert and aware of my presence. "What do you want to talk about?" he finally said. His voice was tired. It was as though his words dragged after each other. I felt very uneasy. It was as if his tiredness was contagious and pulling me. "Nothing in particular," I answered. "I just came to chat with you in a friendly way. You once asked me to come to your house." "Yes, I did. But it's not the same now." "Why isn't it the same?" "Don't you talk with Juan?" "Yes, I do." "Then what do you want with me?" "I thought maybe I could ask you some questions." "Ask Juan. Isn't he teaching you?" "He is, but just the same, I'd like to ask you about what he is teaching me and have your opinion. This way I'll be able to know what to do." "Why do you want to do that? Don't you trust Juan?" "I do." "Then why don't you ask him to tell you what you want to know?" "I do, and he tells me, but if you could also tell me about what Don Juan is teaching me, perhaps I'll understand better." "Juan can tell you everything. He alone can do that. Don't you understand that?" "I do, but then I'd like to talk with people like you, Don Elias. One doesn't find a man of knowledge every day." "Juan is a man of knowledge." "I know that." "Then why are you talking to me?" "I said I came to be friends." "No, you didn't. There's something else about you this time." I wanted to explain myself, and all I could do was mumble incoherently. Zacatecas didn't say anything. He seemed to listen attentively. His eyes were half closed again, but I felt he was peering at me. He nodded almost imperceptibly. Then his lids opened, and I saw his eyes. He seemed to be looking past me. He casually tapped the floor with the tip of his right foot just behind his left heel. His legs were slightly arched. His arms were limp against his sides. Then he lifted his right arm. His hand was open, with the palm turned perpendicular to the ground. His fingers were extended and pointing toward me. He let his hand wobble a couple of times before he brought it to my face level. He held it in that position for an instant, and then he said a few words to me. His voice was very clear, yet the words dragged. After a moment, he dropped his hand to his side and remained motionless, taking a strange position. He was standing, resting on the ball of his left foot. His right foot was crossed behind the heel of the left foot, and he was tapping the floor rhythmically and gently with the tip of his right foot. I felt an unwarranted apprehension, a form of restlessness. My thoughts seemed to be dissociated. I was thinking unrelated, nonsensical thoughts that had nothing to do with what was going on. I noticed my discomfort and tried to steer my thoughts back to the situation at hand, but I couldn't, in spite of a great struggle. It was as if some force was keeping me from concentrating or thinking relevant thoughts. Zacatecas had not said a word, and I didn't know what else to say or do. Quite automatically, I turned around and left. Later on, I felt compelled to tell Don Juan about my encounter with Zacatecas. Don Juan roared with laughter. "What really took place there?" I asked. "Zacatecas danced," Don Juan said. "He saw you, then he danced." "What did he do to me? I felt very cold and dizzy." "He apparently didn't like you and stopped you by tossing a word at you." How could he possibly do that? I exclaimed incredulously. Very simple. He stopped you with his will. What did you say? He stopped you with his will. The explanation didn't suffice. His statements sounded like gibberish to me. I tried to probe him further, but he couldn't explain the event to my satisfaction. Obviously, that event, or any event that occurred within this alien system of sensible interpretation, could be explained or understood only in terms of the units of meaning proper to that system. This work is, therefore, a reportage, and should be read as a reportage. The system I recorded was incomprehensible to me. Thus, the pretense to anything other than reporting about it would be misleading and impertinent. In this respect, I've adopted the phenomenological method and have striven to deal with sorcery solely as phenomena that were presented to me. I, as the perceiver, recorded what I perceived, and at the moment of recording, I endeavored to suspend judgment. Part 1. The Preliminaries of Seeing. Chapter 1. April 2nd, 1968. Don Juan looked at me for a moment and didn't seem at all surprised to see me, even though it had been more than 2 years since I last visited him. He put his hand on my shoulder and smiled gently and said that I looked different, that I was getting fat and soft. I had brought him a copy of my book. Without any preliminaries, I took it out of my briefcase and handed it to him. "It's a book about you, Don Juan," I said. He took it and flipped through the pages as if they were a deck of cards. He liked the green color on the dust jacket and the height of the book. He felt the cover with his palms, turned it around a couple of times, and then handed it back to me. I felt a great surge of pride. "I want you to keep it," I said. He shook his head with a silent laugh. "I better not," he said, and then added with a broad smile, "You know what we do with paper in Mexico." I laughed. I thought his touch of irony was beautiful. We were sitting on a bench in the park of a small town in the mountainous area of central Mexico. I had absolutely no way of letting him know about my intention of paying him a visit, but I was certain I was going to find him, and I did. I waited only a short while in that town before Don Juan came down from the mountains, and I found him at the market, at the stand of one of his friends. Don Juan told me, matter-of-factly, that I was there just in time to take him back to Sonora, and we sat in the park to wait for a friend of his, a Mazatec Indian with whom he lived. We waited about 3 hours. We talked about different, unimportant things, and toward the end of the day, right before his friend came, I related to him some events I had witnessed a few days before. During my trip to see him, my car broke down in the outskirts of a city, and I had to stay in town for 3 days while it was being repaired. There was a motel across the street from an auto shop, but the outskirts of towns are always depressing for me, so I took lodgings in a modern 8-story hotel in the center of town. The bellboy told me that the hotel had a restaurant, and when I came down to eat, I found that there were tables out on the sidewalk. It was a rather handsome arrangement set on the street corner under some low brick arches of modern lines. It was cool outside, and there were empty tables, yet I preferred to sit in the stuffy indoors. I had noticed upon entering that a group of shoeshine boys were sitting on the curb in front of the restaurant, and I was certain they would have hounded me had I taken one of the outside tables. From where I was seated, I could see the group of boys through the glass window. A couple of young men took a table, and the boys flocked around them, asking to shine their shoes. The young men refused, and I was amazed to see that the boys didn't insist and went back to sit on the curb. After a while, 3 men in business suits got up and left, and the boys ran to their table and began eating the leftovers. In a matter of seconds, the plates were clean. The same thing happened with leftovers on all the other tables. I noticed that the children were quite orderly. If they spilled water, they sponged it up with their own shoeshine cloths. I also noticed the thoroughness of their scavenging procedures. They even ate the ice cubes left in the glasses of water and the lemon slices from the tea, peel and all. There was absolutely nothing that they wasted. In the course of the time I stayed in the hotel, I found out that there was an agreement between the children and the manager of the restaurant. The boys were allowed to hang around the premises to make some money from the customers, and were also allowed to eat the leftovers, provided that they didn't harass anybody and didn't break anything. There were 11 in all, ranging in age from 5 to 12. The oldest, however, was kept a distance from the rest of the group. They deliberately ostracized him, taunting him with a sing-song that he already had pubic hair and was too old to be among them. After 3 days of watching them go like vultures after the most meager of leftovers, I became despondent, and I left that city feeling that there was no hope for those children whose world was already molded by their day-after-day struggle for crumbs. "Do you feel sorry for them?" Don Juan exclaimed in a questioning tone. "I certainly do," I said. "Why?" "Because I'm concerned with the well-being of my fellow men. Those are children, and their world is ugly and cheap." Wait. How can you say that their world is ugly and cheap?" Don Juan said, mocking my statement. "You think that you're better off, don't you?" I said I did, and he asked me why. And I told him that in comparison to those children's world, mine was infinitely more varied and rich in experiences and in opportunities for personal satisfaction and development. Don Juan's laughter was friendly and genuine. He said that I wasn't careful with what I was saying, that I had no way of knowing about the richness and the opportunities in the world of those children. I thought Don Juan was being stubborn. I really thought he was taking the opposite view just to annoy me. I sincerely believed that those children didn't have the slightest chance for any intellectual growth. I argued my point for a while longer, and then Don Juan asked me bluntly, "Didn't you once tell me that in your opinion man's greatest accomplishment was to become a man of knowledge?" I had said that, and I repeated again that in my opinion to become a man of knowledge was one of the greatest intellectual accomplishments. "Do you think that your very rich world would ever help you to become a man of knowledge?" Don Juan asked with slight sarcasm. I didn't answer, and he then worded the same question in a different manner, a thing I always do to him when I think he doesn't understand. "In other words," he said, smiling broadly, obviously aware that I was cognizant of his ploy, "can your freedom and opportunities help you to become a man of knowledge?" "No," I said emphatically. "Then how could you feel sorry for those children?" he said seriously. "Any of them could become a man of knowledge. All the men of knowledge I know were kids like those you saw, eating leftovers and licking the tables." Don Juan's argument gave me an uncomfortable sensation. I hadn't felt sorry for those underprivileged children because they didn't have enough to eat, but because in my terms, their world had already condemned them to be intellectually inadequate. And yet, in Don Juan's terms, any of them could achieve what I believe to be the epitome of man's intellectual accomplishment, the goal of becoming a man of knowledge. My reason for pitying them was incongruous. Don Juan had nailed me neatly. "Perhaps you're right," I said. "But how can one avoid the genuine desire to help our fellow men?" "How do you think one can help them?" "By alleviating their burden. The least one can do for our fellow men is to try to change them. You yourself are involved in doing that, aren't you?" "No, I'm not. I don't know what to change, or why to change anything in my fellow men. What about me, Don Juan? Weren't you teaching me so I could change? No, I'm not trying to change you. It may happen that one day you may become a man of knowledge. There's no way to know that. But that will not change you. Someday, perhaps, you'll be able to see men in another mode, and then you'll realize that there's no way to change anything about them. What's this other mode of seeing men, Don Juan? Men look different when you see. The little smoke will help you to see men as fibers of light. Fibers of light? Yes, fibers, like white cobwebs, very fine threads that circulate from the head to the navel. Thus a man looks like an egg of circulating fibers, and his arms and legs are like luminous bristles, bursting out in all directions. Is that the way everyone looks? Everyone. Besides, every man is in touch with everything else, not through his hands, though, but through a bunch of long fibers that shoot out from the center of his abdomen. Those fibers join a man to his surroundings. They keep his balance. They give him stability. So as you may see someday, a man is a luminous egg, whether he's a beggar or a king, and there's no way to change anything. Or rather, what could be changed in that luminous egg? What? Chapter 2. My visit to Don Juan started a new cycle. I had no trouble falling back again into my old pattern of enjoying his sense of drama and his humor and his patience with me. I definitely felt that I had to visit him more often. Not to see Don Juan was indeed a great loss for me. Besides, I had something of particular interest that I wanted to discuss with him. After I had finished the book about his teachings, I began to re-examine the field notes I hadn't used. I had discarded a great deal of data because my emphasis had been on the states of non-ordinary reality. Rehashing my old notes, I had come to the conclusion that a skillful sorcerer could bring forth the most specialized range of perception in his apprentice by simply manipulating social cues. My whole argument about the nature of these manipulatory procedures rested on the assumption that a leader was needed to bring forth the necessary range of perception. I took as a specific test case the sorcerers' peyote meetings. I contended that in those meetings, sorcerers reached an agreement about the nature of reality without any overt exchange of words or signs, and my conclusion was that a very sophisticated code was employed by the participants to arrive at such an agreement. I had constructed a complex system to explain the code and procedures, so I went back to see Don Juan to ask his personal opinion and advice about my work. May 21st, 1968. Nothing out of the ordinary happened during my trip to see Don Juan. The temperature in the desert was over 100 degrees and was quite uncomfortable. The heat subsided in the late afternoon, and by the time I arrived at his house in the early evening, there was a cool breeze. I wasn't very tired, so we sat in his room and talked. I felt comfortable and relaxed, and we talked for hours. It was not a conversation that I would have liked to record. I wasn't really trying to make great sense or trying to draw great meaning. We talked about the weather, the crops, his grandson, the Yaqui Indians, the Mexican government. I told Don Juan how much I enjoyed the exquisite sensation of talking in the dark. He said that my statement was consistent with my talkative nature, that it was easy for me to like chattering in the darkness because talking was the only thing I could do at that time while sitting around. I argued that it was more than the mere act of talking that I enjoyed. I said that I relished the soothing warmth of the darkness around us. He asked me what I did at home when it was dark. I said that invariably I would turn on the lights or I would go out into the lighted streets until it was time to go to sleep. "Oh," he said incredulously. "I thought you'd learned to use the darkness." "What can you use it for?" I asked. He said the darkness, and he called it the darkness of the day, was the best time to see. He stressed the word see with a peculiar inflection. I wanted to know what he meant by that, but he said it was too late to go into it then. May 22nd, 1968. As soon as I woke up in the morning and without any preliminaries, I told Don Juan that I had constructed a system to explain what took place at a peyote meeting, a mitoti. I took my notes and read to him what I'd done. He listened patiently while I struggled to elucidate my schemata. I said that I believed a covert leader was necessary in order to cue the participants so they could arrive at any pertinent agreement. I pointed out that people attend a mitoti to seek the presence of Mescalito and his lessons about the right way to live, and that those persons never exchange a word or a gesture among them, yet they agree about the presence of Mescalito and his specific lesson. At least, that was what they purportedly did in the mitotis I had attended. They agreed that Mescalito had appeared to them individually and had given them a lesson. In my personal experience, I'd found that the form of the individual visit of Mescalito and his consequent lesson were strikingly homogeneous, although varying in content from person to person. I couldn't explain this homogeneity except as a result of a subtle and complex system of cueing. It took me close to 2 hours to read and explain to Don Juan the scheme I'd constructed. I ended my talk by begging him to tell me in his own words what were the exact procedures for reaching agreement. When I'd finished, he frowned. I thought he must have found my explanation challenging. He appeared to be involved in deep deliberation. After a reasonable silence, I asked him what he thought about my idea. My question made him suddenly turn his frown into a smile and then into roaring laughter. I tried to laugh too and asked nervously what was so funny. "You're deranged!" he exclaimed. "Why should anyone be bothered with cueing at such an important time as a mitote? Do you think one ever fools around with Mescalito?" I thought for a moment that he was being evasive. He wasn't really answering my question. "Why should anyone cue?" Don Juan asked stubbornly. "You've been in mitotes. You should know that no one told you how to feel or what to do, no one except Mescalito himself." I insisted that such an explanation wasn't possible and begged him again to tell me how the agreement was reached. "I know why you have come," Don Juan said in a mysterious tone. "I can't help you in your endeavor because there is no system of cueing." "But how can all those persons agree about Mescalito's presence?" "They agree because they see," Don Juan said dramatically, and then added casually, "Why don't you attend another mitote and see for yourself?" I felt that was a trap. I didn't say anything, but put my notes away. He didn't insist. A while later, he asked me to drive him to the house of one of his friends. We spent most of the day there. During the course of a conversation, his friend John asked me what had become of my interest in peyote. John had provided the peyote buttons for my first experience nearly 8 years before. I didn't know what to say to him. Don Juan came to my aid and told John I was doing fine. On our way back to Don Juan's house, I felt obliged to make a comment about John's question, and I said, among other things, that I had no intention of learning any more about peyote because it required a kind of courage I didn't have, and that I had really meant it when I said I had quit. Don Juan smiled and didn't say anything. I kept on talking until we got to the house. We sat on the clean area in front of the door. It was a warm, clear day, but there was enough of a breeze in the late afternoon to make it pleasant. "Why do you have to push so hard?" Don Juan said suddenly. "How many years now have you been saying that you don't want to learn anymore?" 3. "Why are you so vehement about it?" "I feel that I'm betraying you, Don Juan. I think that's why I'm always talking about it." "You're not betraying me." "Well, I've failed you. I've run away. I feel I am defeated." "You do what you can. Besides, you haven't been defeated yet. What I have to teach you is very hard. I, for instance, found it perhaps even harder than you." "But you kept at it, Don Juan. My case is different. I gave up, and I've come to see you not because I want to learn, but only because I wanted to ask you to clarify a point in my work." Don Juan looked at me for a moment, and then he looked away. "You ought to let the smoke guide you again," he said forcefully. "No, Don Juan, I can't use your smoke anymore. I think I've exhausted myself." "You haven't begun." "I'm too afraid." "So you're afraid. There's nothing new about being afraid. Don't think about your fear. Think about the wonders of seeing." "I sincerely wish I could think about those wonders, but I can't. When I think of your smoke, I feel a sort of darkness coming upon me. It's as if there were no more people on the earth, no one to turn to. Your smoke has shown me the ultimate of loneliness, Don Juan." "That's not true. Take me, for example. The smoke is my ally, and I don't feel such a loneliness. But you're different. You've conquered your fear." Don Juan patted me gently on the shoulder. "You're not afraid," he said softly. His voice carried a strange accusation. "Am I lying about my fear, Don Juan?" "I'm not concerned with lies," he said severely. "I'm concerned with something else. The reason you don't want to learn is not because you're afraid. It's something else." I vehemently urged him to tell me what it was. I pleaded with him, but he didn't say anything. He just shook his head as if he couldn't believe I didn't know it. I told him that perhaps it was inertia which kept me from learning. He wanted to know the meaning of the word inertia. I read to him from my dictionary. The tendency of matter to remain at rest, if at rest, or, if moving, to keep moving in the same direction, unless affected by some outside force. "Unless affected by some outside force," he repeated. "That's about the best word you've found. I've told you already. Only a crackpot would undertake the task of becoming a man of knowledge of his own accord. A sober-headed man has to be tricked into doing it." "I'm sure there must be scores of people who would gladly undertake the task," I said. "Yes, but those don't count. They're usually cracked. They're like gourds that look fine from the outside, and yet they'd leak the minute you put pressure on them, the minute you filled them with water. I had to trick you into learning once, the same way my benefactor tricked me. Otherwise, you wouldn't have learned as much as you did. Perhaps it's time to trick you again." The tricking to which he was referring was one of the most crucial points of my apprenticeship. It had taken place years before, yet in my mind it was as vivid as if it had just happened. Through very artful manipulations, Don Juan had once forced me into a direct and terrifying confrontation with a woman reputed to be a sorceress. The clash resulted in a profound animosity on her part. Don Juan exploited my fear of the woman as motivation to continue with the apprenticeship, claiming that I had to learn more about sorcery in order to protect myself against her magical onslaughts. The end results of his tricking were so convincing that I sincerely felt I had no other recourse than to learn as much as possible if I wanted to stay alive. "If you're planning to scare me again with that woman, I simply won't come back anymore," I said. Don Juan's laughter was very joyous. "Don't worry," he said reassuringly. "Tricks with fear won't work with you anymore. You're no longer afraid. But if it is needed, you can be tricked wherever you are. You don't have to be around here for that." He put his arms behind his head and lay down to sleep. I worked on my notes until he woke up a couple of hours later. It was almost dark then. Noticing that I was writing, he sat up straight and, smiling, asked me if I had written myself out of my problem. May 23rd, 1968. We were talking about Oaxaca. I told Don Juan that once I'd arrived in the city on a day when the market was open, a day when scores of Indians from all over the area flocked to town to sell food and all kinds of trinkets. I mentioned that I was particularly interested in a man who was selling medicinal plants. He carried a wooden kit in which he kept a number of small jars with dry, shredded plants, and he stood in the middle of the street holding one jar, yelling a very peculiar sing-song. "I bring here," he would say, "for fleas, flies, mosquitoes, and lice. Also for pigs, horses, goats, and cows. I have here for all the maladies of man, the mumps, the measles, rheumatism, and gout. I bring here for the heart, the liver, the stomach, and the loin. Come near, ladies and gentlemen. I bring here for fleas, flies, mosquitoes, and lice." I had listened to him for a long time. His format consisted of enumerating a long list of man's diseases for which he claimed to have a cure. The device he used to give rhythm to his sing-song was to pause after naming a set of 4. Don Juan said that he also used to sell herbs in the market in Oaxaca when he was young. He said he still remembered his selling pitch, and he yelled it for me. He said that he and his friend Vicente used to make concoctions. "Those concoctions were really good," Don Juan said. "My friend Vicente used to make great extracts of plants." I told Don Juan that once during one of my trips to Mexico, I had met his friend Vicente. Don Juan seemed to be surprised and wanted to know more about it. I was driving through Durango at that time and remembered that Don Juan had once told me I should pay a visit to his friend who lived there. I looked for him and found him and talked to him for a while. Before I left, he gave me a sack with some plants and a series of instructions for replanting one of them. I stopped on my way to the town of Aguascalientes. I made sure there were no people around. For at least 10 minutes, I'd been watching the road and surrounding areas. There hadn't been any houses in sight, nor cattle grazing alongside the road. I stopped on the top of a small hill. From there, I could see the road ahead.